right now I'm working on a book on the 2016 election that I'm writing in real time with John Sides, who's a professor at George Washington, and Lynn Vavrick, who's a professor at UCLA. So we're analyzing data as it comes in on the 2016 election. We're going to try to get it out right as the journalistic accounts come in as kind of a counter to what the conventional wisdom is, with actual data and political science on our side. A lot of time what the journalistic accounts do is that they focus too much on a particular narrative or something that's not very systematic, or they end up putting way too much weight on the campaign itself. And so where we come in is say, okay, no, it's more about this than that, and here's what the data actually say. So the journalistic accounts, and journalists have got a lot better about this over time. They are starting to heed political scientists, and data-driven journalism is much more common than it used to be. So they know about things that do actually affect election outcomes, but even still, there is certainly room for more systematic explanations that go beyond, hey, this person did this because they made such and such a gaffe, which usually does not affect the outcome. So in 2010, we wrote Obama's Race. And at the time, we were really trying to debunk this pernicious myth that we had reached a post-racial world with Obama. And I think a lot of people want to believe that we're in a post-racial world because it's uncomfortable to think about racial inequities in society. One thing I always like to point my students to is polling from the 1950s that said even in the 1950s, the vast majority of whites thought that Black people in this country were being treated fairly. It is often the desire to move past race and to think everything is cured, and I think that this belief that Obama represents post-racialism has really declined in a second term when we've seen things like Trayvon and Black Lives Matter and Ferguson and Baltimore. And so I think even the most ardent, colorblind, post-racialist is kind of now saying, you know what, race still really matters a lot. What I've found in terms of racial attitudes and an Obama effect on racial attitudes is very, very minor changes. So the actual racial attitudes and things like stereotypes, how warmly you feel towards racial groups, something that we call racial resentment, which basically says, are racial inequalities due to structural factors like discrimination, or are they due to individual factors like work ethic? All of those things have been almost entirely constant over the last 8 years. What I have found is that those attitudes are now much stronger predictors of how you feel about politics. So it's not so much that racial attitudes have changed, it's been very static in terms of what people think about race. But their effect on political opinions has gone way up since Obama became president. In the book, there are a lot of implications for the upcoming election. And it's not so much about their change in attitudes per se, but how those attitudes are getting used in politics. And the main takeaway from the forthcoming book is that everything in politics has become more about race, most importantly, party identification. And we're really seeing this play out right now in the primaries, where on the Democratic side of the coin, they're going to South Carolina and they are wooing Black voters with more explicitly racial talk than they have in quite some time. The Democratic Party is moving to the left on race. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, they are courting racially resentful voters quite strongly during the campaign, and we see this a lot in the rhetoric of Donald Trump. The next president will face a big problem in terms of this growing racial polarization that's happening. So one of the things is that I make clear in the book that there's a lot going on in politics. It's not just about racial attitudes. There's a zillion things that influence people's political beliefs. But when politics becomes more infused with race, it becomes particularly polarizing. So there's a lot of research in psychology that shows that attitudes about race are emotionally charged in ways that attitudes about, if you're just talking about ideology or policies, they're not as heated. But when you're talking about race and you're talking about racial divisions, this gets completely heated and it gets very polarizing, and it becomes increasingly difficult to find common ground. So if the campaign continues on its current trajectory, where Democrats are trying actively to court minority voters in a way they haven't, with explicitly appeals to race, and Republicans are trying to appeal to racially conservative voters, ethnocentric voters, well, that becomes increasingly polarizing, and it perpetuates the polarization over race that Barack Obama has presided over. So the main thing in terms of race will be how the next president can potentially bridge the racial divide, both in terms of race and ethnicity and in terms of racial attitudes. So in terms of bridging the divide over race and racial attitudes, I think the only thing that could solve that coming out of the presidential election is if a moderate Republican was elected who moderated the party's tone on race and immigration issues. And the one candidate that strikes me as having the potential to do this is John Kasich, who often talks about race in a much less hostile fashion than other Republicans. Now, if a Democrat is elected, they're going to have a hard time bridging the divide on race, because if they talk about race, well, then it puts racial conservatives on the defensive. And so in general, in order to move attitudes, you have to have somebody of your own party be the person to take that message. And as the current Republican nomination stands, they are not doing much at all to help bridge that divide in terms of white voters. So it would probably take a Republican moderate to do that. So one of the things that I hope my research does is that it does draw attention to the ongoing inequalities in this country over race, and that we have not moved beyond these inequalities and that they need to be addressed. And so there is often a desire to say, hey, we've moved beyond race, but when you look at some of the implications, no, this division is very much lasting, and it will take profound effort to remedy.